Imagine deciding to build a 50-story skyscraper out of wet cardboard.
Right, just wet cardboard and like paper mache.
Exactly. And you could hire the most expensive PR firm on the planet, to run a massive media campaign calling your building this impenetrable concrete fortress.
Yeah, you could aggressively silence anyone who points out the damp walls.
Right. You could even convince yourself that you've successfully conquered the laws of physics. But eventually, and this is the kicker, gravity is going to collect its debt.
It always does.
The building will collapse, not because of bad luck, but because of mathematical certainty. And today, we're doing a deep dive into a really controversial argument that suggests modern global empires are doing exactly that.
Yeah, basically building geopolitical skyscrapers out of wet cardboard.
And desperately trying to outrun gravity.
It's a profound shift in how we are taught to view the world, honestly. I mean, we usually accept the cliche that history is written by the victors, right?
Sure, that whoever has the biggest military or the deepest pockets gets to dictate reality.
Exactly. But the framework we are exploring today completely rejects that premise. It proposes that power does not create truth. Instead, reality always, inevitably, balances its own books.
So to explore this, we are diving into a really complex, fascinating piece from a platform called Knowledge is King.
Yeah, written by Mark Wells.
Right. The piece is titled The Debt of Truth, Why Global Exploitation Faces an Inevitable. And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack Wells's central thesis, which is that modern systems of global exploitation are, well, they're fighting a losing battle against the fundamental laws of reality.
It's a huge claim.
It is. And before we start mapping out the architecture of his argument, I do want to drop a quick note on the terrain we are covering today.
Yeah, that's important.
Because this text wades into some heavily charged themes, specifically regarding the mechanics of modern imperialism and the structural tenets of Islam.
Which means our role here, just to be clear, is not to litigate theology, or endorse specific geopolitical viewpoints.
Right. We're not taking sides here.
Exactly. We are treating this text like a blueprint. We're going to step back, lay it out on the table, and impartially examine the structural logic of the author's claims.
We want to understand how he connects historical events from, centuries ago to the modern systems of finance and resource extraction operating right now.
So let's establish the foundation of that blueprint. To understand anything the author is arguing, you have to wrap your head around a concept he introduces called Al-Haq.
Al-Haq, which translates to the truth or the reality, right?
Yes. But he isn't using it the way we usually use the word truth in casual conversation. He isn't talking about a subjective moral preference, like just being an honest person.
You're talking about structural gravity.
Exactly. The author treats Al-Haq as the objective underlying state of existence. It's the unyielding baseline of reality.
Okay, so if a society builds an economic or political system that aligns with that baseline, it's stable.
Right. But if a system ignores those fundamental laws, if it relies on exploitation, extreme inequality, or deception, you aren't actually altering reality.
You're just accumulating friction.
Yeah, you're building up a massive compounding debt that the universe will eventually force you to repay.
And to demonstrate how this gravity functions, the author doesn't start with modern Wall Street or, 20th century colonialism. He takes us back roughly 1,400 years.
To what he calls the Meccan blueprint.
Right. He sets the stage in 7th century Mecca, which at the time was dominated by this deeply entrenched pagan hierarchy known as the Quraysh elite.
Yeah, and they held absolute monopolies on trade, social status, and economic mobility. Mecca was a massive commercial hub.
Because of the Kaaba, right?
Exactly. The Quraysh managed the Kaaba, which housed idols representing dozens of different tribes. Because of this, tribes from all over the region would travel to Mecca for pilgrimage, which brought trade, wealth, and influence.
So the elite really relied on this highly stratified, divided society to maintain their power.
They absolutely did. And then the Prophet Muhammad begins preaching a message that fundamentally disrupts their entire ecosystem.
Now, I have to say, I have a hard time buying the author's specific framing of this moment.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, we're talking about the foundation of a major world religion, but Wells seems to be stripping away the spiritual lens almost entirely to reframe this as a classic Marxist economic class struggle.
I see what you mean.
He argues the Quraysh elite were in a panic over their wealth, not their theology. Isn't that an overly cynical way to look at a profound religious awakening?
Well, it sounds cynical if we separate the spiritual from the material, which is, a very modern Western habit.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, the author is actually arguing that you cannot separate them. In his view, a genuine spiritual truth cannot exist without having immediate disruptive consequences on unjust economic systems.
Okay, wait, walk me through that.
So when the Prophet Muhammad declared that there is only one God and therefore all human beings are radically equal regardless of bloodline, race, or tribal status, that theology is the class struggle.
Oh, I see the mechanism now. Because if you tear down the physical idols, you remove the justification for tribal supremacy.
Exactly.
If no tribe is spiritually superior, no tribe has the divine right to monopolize the trade routes. The spiritual declaration of equality inherently demands the dismantling of their economic monopolies.
That is the exact threat the Quraysh faced. If everyone is suddenly equal, the hierarchy collapses. The economic engine of their dominance just stops working.
So they had to fight back to protect the status quo.
Right. And the tactics they use to suppress this movement are vital to the author's thesis because they reveal the mechanics of a system trying to fight gravity.
The text details how they utilized misdirection, intense social boycotts, and character assassination. And I want to pause on the social boycotts for a second, because they weren't just like people refusing to buy goods.
No, it was brutal.
The Quraysh literally banished the early Muslims to a barren valley and cut off all food and trade. They were trying to starve the movement into submission. They deployed every ounce of their systemic power to crush the message.
They viewed their resistance as a permanent defense of their empire. But through the lens of Al-Haq, this resistance was entirely an illusion. It was merely a period of testing.
Because they were trying to prop up a system built on falsehood?
Exactly. The author refers to that falsehood as Batil. They were burning through their resources and social capital just to delay the inevitable. The physics of reality were already acting on their paper house.
And ultimately, the hierarchy collapsed, and the system of equality prevailed.
Because gravity always wins.
Always wins. And this brings us to the core of the author's argument. Because he establishes that this 7th century pushback was fundamentally about protecting wealth from the threat of equality, he then draws a direct causal line to the present day.
Yeah, he maps this exact dynamic onto modern global finance and imperialism.
He argues that the players have changed, but the board remains identical.
Because modern empires operate on the exact same logic as the Meccan elite. I mean, an empire, by definition, requires the extraction of natural resources from the periphery to enrich the core. It requires structural inequality to function.
But just like in 7th century Mecca, the empire encounters a barrier. The author claims that the structural tenets of the Islamic system act as a functional blockade against modern exploitation.
And he doesn't just make a vague cultural claim either.
No, he points to 3 specific prohibitions that dismantle the machinery of empire. Let's look at the first one, the strict prohibition of Riba.
Which is often translated as usury or, exploitative interest.
Right.
To understand why this is such a massive barrier, you have to look at the primary mechanism of global finance today. Powerful nations rarely exert control through direct military occupation anymore.
It's too expensive and unpopular.
Exactly. Instead, they use debt. Developing nations are offered these massive loans for infrastructure or development, but the interest on those loans compounds at rates that are mathematically impossible to repay.
The debt grows until the country defaults, and suddenly the creditors demand structural adjustments. They force the nation to hand over its public utilities, its ports, or its natural resources just to service the interest. It's basically a modern, sanitized version of debt slavery.
Right, and by legally and morally prohibiting riba, the Islamic framework inherently blocks the deployment of compounding debt. It demands that economic transactions involve shared risk.
Rather than just guaranteeing a profit for the lender, even if the borrower's enterprise completely fails.
Exactly. This prohibition neutralizes the primary financial snare used by global powers to strip nations of their sovereignty.
Okay, so if a global power finds that its financial snare is blocked by the prohibition of debt, it might just try to buy up the physical resources directly.
But the text argues that the system blocks that avenue as well.
Right, through the prohibition of monopolization.
The framework categorizes foundational resources, specifically water, pasture, and energy, as a shared public trust. They belong to the collective.
Wow.
This fundamentally prevents the kind of corporate resource hoarding that drives imperial expansion. If a foreign entity attempts to enter a region and privatize the water supply or monopolize the agricultural land for export, they are running headfirst into a structural theological mandate that outlaws that exact behavior.
You cannot build an exploitative empire if you are structurally barred from monopolizing the loot,
Exactly.
which leaves the empire with its oldest, most reliable tool, dividing the population against itself.
But the author argues that the system's explicit rejection of artificial tribalism and nationalism neutralizes this tactic too.
Because think about the classic imperial strategy, divide and conquer. You draw arbitrary lines on a map, you elevate one ethnic group over another, and you incite internal conflict.
Right, and while the local populations are busy fighting each other over artificial borders, the empire quietly extracts the wealth.
But the author points out that this system prioritizes piety and moral character above all tribal or national affiliations. So if a population genuinely anchors its identity in a shared moral framework rather than ethnic lines, the empire's strategy fails.
It completely strips the weapon of its ammunition. If the population refuses to view themselves as competing ethnic factions, the artificial borders lose their power to divide.
Listening to this breakdown, the best way I can conceptualize these three pillars is by thinking about a computer operating system.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, think about a malicious virus, right? Malware is designed to infiltrate your computer, lock up your files, extract your data, and turn your machine into a zombie for a hacker's benefit. Modern imperial systems operate like malware.
Okay, yeah.
They use debt to lock up a country's economy, monopolies to extract its data like the natural resources, and tribalism to turn the system's components against themselves.
And if we take that analogy to its logical conclusion, the author is arguing that the structural Islamic system functions as a hard-coded antivirus.
Exactly. Wait, actually, it operates on a completely different base code entirely. It rejects the commands. When the empire tries to execute the compounding debt file, the system blocks it.
Right.
When it tries to run the monopolize water command, access is denied. When it tries to launch the ethnic hatred executable, the operating system simply cannot read the file because its core identity is built on moral character, not tribalism.
That's a perfect way to look at it. And this is where we reach the most provocative and controversial section of the author's thesis.
A pushback?
Yes. If this system genuinely acts as an impenetrable antivirus blocking global resource extraction, how do modern powers deal with it? They cannot defeat the internal logic of the antivirus, and they certainly cannot simply abandon their need for resources.
So they have to attack the public perception of the antivirus itself. They rely on misdirection.
The author asserts that modern powers recycle the exact defensive tactics deployed by the 7th century Meccan elites. They pivot to character assassination. And this is where he makes the deeply controversial claim that the widespread labeling of Islam as a violent religion is not an objective sociological observation, but a calculated geopolitical strategy.
He's arguing that framing the religion primarily as a threat manufactures the necessary justification to dismantle it.
Because if you can convince the global public that the antivirus software is actually a dangerous piece of malware, the public will applaud when you send the military in to uninstall it.
The narrative of inherent violence provides the ultimate moral cover. When the empire moves in to neutralize the barrier, the domestic public doesn't look at the lithium mines, the oil fields, or the trade routes being secured.
No, they simply feel relief that a global threat is being managed.
Exactly. The misdirection hides the economic extraction behind a veil of security and moral superiority.
Which circles back to the philosophical core of the piece. The author heavily contrasts Al-Haq, the fundamental reality of human equality and systemic justice, with Batil, which represents falsehood, illusion, and injustice. He claims that any system built on Batil, like an empire relying on debt and exploitation, is inherently unstable. It creates a massive imbalance in the universe.
And this imbalance generates a cost. There's a specific quote from the text that perfectly captures this mechanism. The author writes, "Misdirection is only a way of delaying the tuition, the inevitable cost that must be paid when a system defies the word of truth."
Tuition is such a deliberate word choice.
Isn't it?
It frames the collapse not as a punishment, but as an educational expense. You are being forced to learn a lesson about reality, and the longer you delay that lesson by pouring money into PR campaigns or military suppression, the higher the tuition bill climbs.
Because the cost of maintaining a paper house increases exponentially as the structure begins to rot. You have to buy more PR, fund more proxy conflicts, and suppress more dissent just to maintain the illusion of stability.
But I want to push you on how this applies to what we actually see in the world today. Because if we accept to the author's premise that the system isn't inherently violent, how does he account for the undeniable geopolitical friction, the unrest and the violence we witness in these regions on the nightly news? Like, what is actually happening mechanically?
Well, the author would describe it as the violent friction of two massive tectonic plates colliding.
Okay.
One plate is the artificial system of Batil, the modern empire demanding extraction, monopolies, and subservience. The other plate is the unyielding bedrock of Al-Haq, the structural barrier demanding equity, shared resources, and freedom from debt.
Wow.
When the artificial system relentlessly tries to force its way over the bedrock, the immense pressure generates earthquakes, sparks fly.
And the brilliance of the misdirection is that the architects of the artificial system point at the earthquake and say, look how violent and unstable that bedrock is.
Exactly.
They blame the gravity for their poorly constructed skyscraper falling apart, completely ignoring that the violence is the direct result of their relentless attempt to crush the barrier.
They attribute the friction entirely to the structural barrier, completely absolving themselves of any responsibility for the immense pressure they are applying.
Which leads us to the author's ultimate conclusion about the trajectory of global power. If misdirection only delays the tuition, and the debt of truth is constantly compounding, what is the endgame for these modern systems of exploitation?
The endgame is a mathematical certainty. Just as the Meccan hierarchy, despite all its entrenched wealth, its severe boycotts, and its propaganda, inevitably collapsed and gave way to a system of equality, modern systems face the exact same fate.
They're bound by the same physical laws of Al-Haq.
They are just borrowing time from reality. I mean, you can use massive media networks to obscure the truth. You can deploy drones to delay justice. But an economic and political engine that requires the theft of resources and the manipulation of societies is structurally doomed. It cannot sustain itself indefinitely.
The universe always balances the books.
Always. The reality returns to the center. And the author is really demanding a paradigm shift from the reader here. He wants you to stop viewing history as a chaotic sequence of who conquered whom and start viewing it as the slow, inexorable balancing of a cosmic ledger.
This framework profoundly challenges you, the listener, to change the way you consume the daily news.
It really does.
When you are scrolling through your feed or watching a broadcast and you hear certain geopolitical narratives being forcefully pushed when specific regions or ideologies are universally labeled as threats to stability, this deep dive asks you to look behind the curtain of the PR campaign.
It demands that you apply critical structural logic. Instead of accepting the narrative of the threat at face value, ask yourself what specific economic or resource-based status quo is this narrative working to protect?
Right. Who stands to benefit financially if we believe this system must be dismantled?
Are we actually looking at a threat to human flourishing, or are we looking at a robust antivirus software that is simply getting in the way of $1 trillion wealth extraction?
It forces you to question whether the skyscraper we are being told to admire is actually made of concrete.
And recognizing the wet cardboard is the first step in preparing for the collapse.
As we wrap up this deep dive into Mark Wells's analysis, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over. We have spent the last 15 minutes or so discussing massive macro-level concepts, global empires, international finance, 14 centuries of history.
Yeah, heavy stuff.
But if Al-Haq, this concept of structural reality and inevitable consequences, is truly a fundamental law of existence, it doesn't just apply to empires fighting over lithium mines.
Not at all. It applies to everything. The physics scale down perfectly.
So take a look around your own world. What smaller, everyday systems in our own societies are currently operating on Batil?
Right. Think about your local economy.
Or your corporate workplace, or even the social dynamics in your own community. Where are we relying on extraction, artificial divisions, or misdirection to maintain an illusion of success?
What personal paper houses are we living in right now?
Running up a massive debt of truth, simply hoping that the gravity of reality never kicks in. Because if the author's premise holds true, the tuition bill is already in the mail.